All right, everybody, we are here with Andrew of the automation team. Me and Andrew actually go back a long ways with the subject we're talking about today, and that is the automation to BeamNG exporter, but not just like the visual part of it, the feel, man, the feel.
Yeah, amusingly, despite mostly being an artist, I haven't had much connection with the visual part of the exporter, but I've had quite a lot of connection with the physics part of it.
It is interesting. I made some questions for you to think about, but one that I came up with right before we did this is like, how did you get here? Because this seems to be kind of like one of your prominent roles on the team now.
Mostly just because I would keep spotting little bits and pieces that I wished we could improve on the Beam exporter. I had the time to look at them because I wasn't working on anything as important. Um, so I'd just like go, "Hey, programmer, can you show me where this thing is set?" Uh, and then from there, I kind of ended up learning enough about how it worked to start to go a bit further.
Yeah, I do feel like there's a good part of it where like, hey, this has been a long time now. Can you believe it's been like almost 6 years since this has
Right?
been released? But I think there's been
Yeah.
enough time now where both you guys have like played with it a little bit and you've seen people make videos and make content about it. So I think maybe you have a little bit more reference of like, all right, sure, it was done and it worked, but is it right?
Yeah, also Beam's gotten heaps better since we released it. Like, there's loads of stuff where we'll go back and be like, oh, we're doing this in some simple, dumb way that doesn't make sense. And then we'll look into it and be like, oh, that's because that's how Beam worked all that time ago.
Right.
And they've
Yeah.
come up with a much better way in the meantime.
That's a great point because I do feel like maybe not enough people are paying attention to how much more heavy-handed Beam is being with the sim stuff in the last 5 years than they were in the previous.
Oh, it's gotten so much better. And when you're digging around in all the J Beam stuff and you look at what's in what's new in them. They've put a lot of work into a lot of different things that people don't really pay attention to, but have made a big difference.
All right, so as of now, what is the direction you're going? Like what are the recent updates focused on?
The huge one was tires. Between various updates, we've kind of gone back and forth between tires that are incredibly forgiving in an arcadey way and have more grip than automation implies they should, and then ones that have the right amount of grip but don't let go in a very nice way, like have really odd behavior on the limit. So
What was the starting point? Was it too easy?
I don't remember what the starting point was on the original release because it's so long ago now, but a year or two ago it was too easy and too grippy, and like you could straight up compare it to automation's like G figures, and you would be gaining more grip than you should. In trying to fix that, like reducing the grip down to sensible levels exposed the fact that the behavior at the limit of grip was not so good.
What were the absolute details that you changed as far as the exporter now that have made the biggest change?
Probably the combination of tweaking Strybeck and sliding friction parameters. So the Strybeck values are all about uh, how quickly the transition between static and sliding friction happens, like how sharp that curve is, how fast the tire can be sliding. So it's not actually quite slip angle; it's like sliding velocity. How fast the tire can be sliding before it goes to sliding friction, making it so that it can't slide very much before it goes to sliding friction, but increasing how grippy sliding friction is. That combination of things was huge, and we also went through a whole bunch of the suspension geometry and corrected a few quirks with that. Either things that made them a bit too wobbly when they were loaded hard, a few geometry tweaks just generally make them behave a bit more consistently and keep alignment. We did a bunch of stuff about how torque converters work on automatics because they always used to be really weird and used to sort of flare in revs oddly and stuff, and they're a lot
Hmm.
closer now.
Well,
That only applies to some cars, but
right.
it's a lot better. Oh, I guess another interesting one was aerodynamics, where because Beam does aerodynamics by like looking at the shape of the car, and we don't as such. And we do a bunch of stuff that doesn't change the shape of the car but does change the aerodynamics, like moving quality sliders and that kind of stuff.
Oh, right.
The aerodynamics used to just be like, if you were lucky, they were vaguely similar. I mean, they had the same frontal areas, they should be. But the top speed could be way out. You get heaps of lift that you shouldn't get.
Yeah, I think we fought lift in the first go around of kind of redoing the exporter. Was just some cars would just have wild amounts of lift and
yeah, and it's never going to match at all, really, because Beam is just running its own aerodynamic simulation, which the chances of it matching with automation is basically zero.
right.
So our solution with that in the end is basically the car itself doesn't interact with the aerodynamics sim and has like an aerodynamics cube inside it that has the correct drag and lift applied to it. And like the correct amount of lift on the front and rear axles and that kind of stuff based on what automation's results are, meaning any change you make in automation that changes aerodynamics, those results should come through to Beam. Not necessarily perfectly accurately, but...
automation isn't giving you aerodynamics based on the morphs and stuff that you're doing on the body necessarily. It's more to do with the choices you've selected as you were building the car.
Yeah, there's loads of stuff of, how much cooling airflow is there and all that kind of stuff. And we don't actually change a physical shape of the car for that. So we have to fake it correctly. So that's helped heaps.
So how do you figure out if things are working right or not working right? Like, how do you determine if maybe it's just a bad car or if it's a bad export?
Yeah, that's hard. Especially when players are saying, like, my car drives scary. It's really hard to know whether that's because they've made a scary car or
my 1,000-pound V16 car doesn't drive well at all.
Yeah, I mean, those are more obvious as soon as you load it. You're like, oh yeah, well, that's why. But sometimes it's subtle things like, oh yeah, but your rear suspension's way too hard or something. It's like you just set it up weird.
But fundamentally, you noticed there was things wrong with the exports.
Yeah, I mean, there's some objective things you can work out pretty quick. Like, it's real easy. The first pass on tire stuff is always just basically driving around in circles on the grid map and working out how many Gs they pull and making sure that matches what automation thinks they pull.
Is the automation number something that you are comparing to real life, or like how is that automation number getting calibrated?
Yeah, we did another run over the automation numbers in the last update. Just lots of like tire test, like Car Magazine tire test data and road and track skid pan data and stuff like that. Try and dial it in. I think it feels pretty close these days. I'm not 100% sure how good it is for like really old cross plies and stuff because the data on those is so hard to find. Might be a little bit under grippy. But yeah, so then going to Beam, step one is matching the amount of actual like number of Gs of grip it's supposed to have. But then the behavior as you overstep the limits of grip is completely subjective. Like there's no data to compare to. So that's a lot of test driving and a lot of like comparing to the various cars I have driven on a track and giving them to you to compare to the various cars you've driven on track. And we have some other beta testers, particularly call out Slim Jim, who had done so much test driving of everything ever and always comes back with detailed pages of feedback about exactly how the tires feel. So
all right, so the only thing I need to know now is how critical was breaking my car towards refining the physics engine?
So there's lots of when we were refining a lot of the suspension, a lot of the tests we were doing were like putting semi-slicks on things and then launching them really hard and watching the rear suspension try and rip itself out of the car and trying to work out how to stop that happening. And launching your real life car on semi-slicks and ripping apart the rear suspension was a good experience for that, I guess.
I'm gonna take that and these now permanent scars I have on my arm from welding that back together as a trophy.
Whoops. I'm such a smooth driver, though.
But really, honestly, I think one of our most common test mules was my car because both of us have that frame of reference of like vaguely how it drives in a certain situation. But I think that's really critical towards getting things to feel right-ish.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I wish I'd driven a lot more different cars on the track because that would
Right.
probably help.
And on that subject, if there are people out there, because I think there's a number of people out there that are pretty diehard sim racing people that delve into the Beam world and maybe the automation of Beam world. If they have feedback, you guys want to hear it. Like, you guys have always been super open to people's feedback. So if there's someone out there that, drives some old vintage car on bias plies on the racetrack and you have feedback, let them know. Like, there's a Discord.
That'd be so useful. Like, we have plenty of people who know how like modern sports cars drive. None of us have the slightest clue how to correctly tune the handling of like a 1950s Ferrari GTO or
Right.
something. Like, if you've driven a like 1950s Chevy flat out on a track, please tell me. I want to know how that drives. Because
Right.
all we can do is our best guess, and probably not that close yet.
Didn't we have somebody that was testing with that had a Viper race car that we were also matching?
Yeah, I think
Somebody had submitted a car to you or something like that.
Slim Jim at some point had driven a Viper on a track, so he could have the basis for comparison. But yeah, anybody who can test drive things and compare to a real car is perfect.
With something like how it feels, there is no data other than just getting a lot of voices to be like, hey, I think this is a little wrong this way or a little wrong that way. And then trying to figure out who doesn't know how to drive and, who actually knows.
Yeah, the who doesn't know how to drive is a big one. I mean, not as an insult to anyone's abilities, but just there are people who are quite used to more arcadey race sims. Well, not race sims. Or used to things like Forza or that kind of level of racing game, and if it behaves in a way that's more simmy and unforgiving than that, they might think that that's a problem with the handling model. But it's more that a lot of those games don't really simulate tire behavior very well. So it's reasonably common that someone will send us a car to have a look at and be like, this thing has no grip, it's really hard to drive, and we drive it and it's like, oh, this drives like that car pretty much would on a track.
Right.
It's like that. This feels good, and then they're like, oh, okay, maybe I'm just overestimating how grippy a car on like hard 155 wide tires should drive.
That's a good point in that automation is not a race car building game. Like at its core, it is a street car. It is a production car building game. Now, you guys have added a bunch of tools lately that kind of stretch a little further into the race car stuff for those that want to do that. But previously, that stuff was pretty minimalistic.
Yeah, we sort of push a little bit into cars that would be like if you bought a road car and set it up for track days is kind of the, and maybe I think the most race car thing that we consider that you could build is like maybe a GT3 car or something's pretty reasonable.
It doesn't stop people from doing it, but that's the most automation is really tasked with doing.
Yeah, and a fun thing with BeamNG is because it's so physicsy and because everything has a weight and a stiffness, things start to get a bit unstable and nasty when you get really, really light. So a lot of the worst problems are if you try and build like a 400 kilo car, you'll just find the thing starts to tear itself apart in some cases.
BeamNG is very unique compared to any other driving sim out there. How has it been just like kind of diving into the code a little bit of Beam to try to figure out how to make, your cars do better?
Yeah, I mean, it's very different to how you'd expect these things to work because every other racing sim is like, this is a bunch of code dedicated to simulating how a car works. So you feed it a bunch of stuff about a car. BeamNG is more like a physics simulator for generic objects. It has a lot of car specific stuff, but you're not going like, here is a suspension and here is what its camber curve looks like and here's how it behaves. You're going, here is a physical object. It is a suspension arm. It pivots here. It weighs this much, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So you kind of got to approach it completely differently. It's a lot more like engineering a real car, where you're less about like, I need to tell this simulation how to simulate a car, and it's a lot more about like, I need to design a car and I need to decide the geometry of all its moving parts and their weight and their friction and their everything. So it's a lot more of an actual engineering challenge than a simulation challenge.
Right. I remember, in 2015 or so, you guys knew you wanted to do an exporter, but you didn't know exactly which game that was going to be. There's another sim that shall not be named that I definitely tested some cars for you. I think personally it's worked out really well. Are you guys still happy with that choice?
Oh God, yeah. Just the amount of stuff it simulates in terms of like, if we want to do interesting torque vectoring, or if we want to like the fact that it simulates torque converters and automatics properly, for example. No one else really does that.
Right.
There's just all these like nuances of a car design that a racing simulator wouldn't really bother with, because like, why would a racing simulator want to accurately simulate what like a 1960s car with 50 horsepower and a two-speed automatic drives
Right.
like? There's no need for that. But Beam wants to simulate every aspect of every possible car. And also, it's open enough to modding that we can just go like, oh, there's a feature that Beam doesn't simulate. We could just sort of make it do that, because it'll just be like a different type of object that pushes and pulls some numbers around that didn't before. Of course, the other good reason with Beam is that they've just been the most helpful possible to us. Like, I've spent, oh my god, so many hours with Corey from their physics team working out stuff in the past couple of months. And even before that, like the whole time we were developing the exporter, they've done everything we could possibly want. We'll often be like, oh, our cars technically need this feature to export properly. Can you add it? And they just will.
Right.
So we can't ask for better than that with them. They're great.
Yeah, I remember we were early in this like redo of the exporter physics, and I think you and I had gotten to a point where we were like, yeah, this is starting to feel like we want it to feel. And then I kind of didn't hear from you for a week, and then a week later you were like, so I got a hold of Corey. We just rewrote everything because it was just like a completely different approach to getting the same result, but it was more in line with how the beam stuff worked.
Although interestingly, even after that, there was a bit more of a further with tires. Was a bit more of a further rewrite that was somewhat different to how Beam does it. That I think was the final step that gave the best result. We ended up increasing the sliding friction of tires. So there's like a drop in friction as the velocity of the sliding velocity of the tire increases. It goes between like static and dynamic friction. And I'm of the opinion that maybe that drop off is too far on beam cars for my taste. So we brought that up, but then made the transition, like how quickly it breaks away, a bit quicker and more brutal. So like it's easier to make it slide, but it has more grip once it's sliding.
Gotcha.
And that was for me what brought it to feeling like I expect a car on a track to feel.
There's so much that goes into how the cars drive.
Oh yeah.
But the tires, I think, are always going to be the top of the pile, right? There's so much dynamic stuff happening in the tires that if that's wrong, no matter what you change in the rest of the car, you're not going to make it right.
Yeah. And like I've always said that basically I think a race sim is a tire simulator with some other stuff attached to it. And when you look at what goes into the development of racing sims, it's mostly just like we're developing a tire model and then, oh yeah, there's suspension in a car and stuff. But that's easy.
Right.
You know how suspension moves, everything else about a car is simple to simulate. Tires are not.
But not with Beam, because everything, like they treat every part of the car as if it were the tires, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and the other thing is even the tires are harder than you'd expect, because in a normal race sim, the tires will have all these like defined slip angle curves and all that kind of stuff, but they won't be like a physical object as such. Whereas tires in Beam are a physical object with like the ability to deform in any direction and tear
Right.
themselves apart.
Yeah.
The one I
How much did we come across that where the tires would just disintegrate?
Oh yeah, yeah, and the problem is tires change a lot in how they perform based on how stiff they are in certain directions. And in a lot of cases, how stiff they want to be is very close to the amount of stiffness that would cause them to tear themselves apart instantly. The big problem with that is it's easy if you're making a beam car. If you're making a beam car, you just tweak all the numbers until it
Oh,
does exactly what you want.
right.
But automation automation can make tires of any size and compound, and it has to have a sliding scale of every single type of like stiffness value and stuff that no matter what combination of these values you choose, it not only drives correct but doesn't explode.
Like if you go into Beam, there's like a selection of tires to choose from. Like they have engineered these tires.
Yeah,
Automation has basically an infinite combination of that.
yeah, and that's the problem with everything. In the automation exporter is that everything can be anything.
Whoa.
Like, you know,
Now there's a sales pitch line right there.
right? Like suspension geometry, that's an easier one, but it's still like your car could have any combination of weight and track width and wheelbase and all that kind of stuff. It's not like Beam where the car will have a specific one and you tweak it till it's right.
Right.
Like we don't know what's going to come into the exporter, so we have to get it to cope with all of that.
It's a monumental task.
Yeah, it's important to realize it will never be as good as a car built for Beam from scratch,
Right.
because it just can't be.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
there are a lot of cases where that's just the thing.
it's getting closer. Like if you look at stuff from the early exporter versus now, it went from kind of being what I would call a neat toy to now I think you can get things that are of game quality. Like some games out there, maybe not Beam, like Beam's cars are insanely detailed, like insane level detailed. But if
Yeah.
you could make something from automation, put it into Beam, and absolutely it would be say like Gran Turismo level or like, a Forza level.
Yeah, I think the only thing that um, keeps it from that kind of level is mostly interior stuff. But with with a bunch of manual work, there are people who've done really, really nice
Yeah,
interiors with like functioning gauges and all of everything.
you can get there.
The tools for that aren't that easy, but you
Yeah.
totally can get to that level. One thing I do want to have a look at is I know a lot of people build cars entirely out of fixtures, which, while it was never intended to be the way it worked, it is a cool way of doing some stuff.
I think it's a natural evolution.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. We need to see what we can do to support that a little better. Currently, and hot tip for anyone who's building cars that way, there is a nice workaround here. Currently, you have one of two problems. If you make the car body transparent and build it out of fixtures, there's a good chance that it'll be too floppy because a transparent car body does not export the J beams for the
Oh,
body.
wow.
Yeah, being transparent specifically removes it, and that's to stop a bunch of things that exist for like game reasons but shouldn't export as physics objects from exporting. And also to make it that, if you have a like super tall car and you build a really low car out of fixtures, the collision box shouldn't be that of a super tall car.
Right.
But that can make a fixture only car too floppy. So the workaround for this is if you make the entire car body be glass and then you set the opacity of the glass to 0, you now have a car body that's invisible but does exist in JBeam. That does mean that the collision box will be
Wrong.
The JBeam will be wrong. It'll be the shape of the original body, but it will also make it stiff enough to not be floppy, maybe.
Drivable.
It'll be drivable, yeah. But it'd be nice to add a few export options to make it a bit easier to make fixture-only cars like that. It's always going to be really, really hard and sort of out of the scope of how things are meant to be able to work. But we can certainly try give people tools to make it easier.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to answer some questions on this. It's been one of the most enjoyable things for me in recent history. Kind of working with you guys on this as much as you need me, and I appreciate the opportunity for that, and I appreciate you taking the time to blab about it. I'm sure people will enjoy hearing some of the like fine details of it.
Yeah, and give people more of an understanding of what goes into it, and what's easy to fix, what's hard to fix, what's changed over the years.
Expectations. I feel like there's a lot of times that people expect a certain thing out of the exporter that they're not getting, but maybe don't
Yeah,
understand
like
why.
I understand almost everybody's expectations and like agree with what they want. It's just some of the time it's like, oh, that is impossibly complicated.
Right. I feel like pretty much any time we did a build off on stream, we would run into something like that, and you guys would just be like, oh, "But it's hard."
Yeah, I think the thing to realize is that a lot of the time it's genuinely a miracle that things work as well as they do.
Yes, that's well said.